Well, here we are today with Justin Perkins at Mystery Room Mastering, and we want to thank you for having ODBC here and being part of your studio setup. I'd like to get a little bit of background of you first. How did you start in the music industry?
It was a slow progression. I started doing music for fun in middle school with my friends. Back then in the 90s, recording studios were, I don't want to say they're expensive, but they're more expensive than they were now. We had no business being in one. So yeah, just a combination of recording our own bands and then other bands that would ask me, and it just kind of snowballed. I was doing this in my dad's basement. Sometimes I would go to their place. It was so portable. It wasn't much of a studio. It was like,
Yeah, a little 8-track.
It's called a porta studio, yeah.
Yeah.
A few mics. You could load it up in a car, no problem. But eventually it started to become more of a career, or at least where I could make a living. You can go to school, you can have the best equipment, you can have the best everything, but people need to want to work with you. So you have to take time to develop your skills, and it doesn't happen overnight. You got to train your ear to know what people are going to like. You got to adapt to trends. Even though your taste might change over 10 years. I might do something in 10 years that I think is not great right now. So you just have to always be learning, and it's a slow process to get to a point where you can probably support yourself, make a living at it, because it's a very word-of-mouth industry. People don't hire you because you went to this school or you have this piece of equipment. They hire you because they heard something that you did and they like the sound of it, and then even then they still have to enjoy working with you.
Yeah.
There's a few layers to it, so there's no shortcut at all. I mean, people can get lucky and have a success, earlier in their career. That's happened, but that's pretty rare. Usually it's more of a slow process where you're just growing your client base slowly and making sure you get those repeat clients. A band could break up, but then those people might start 2 other bands, and then it just really grows from there. You just have to take your time, be patient, really. There was a studio in Green Bay, Wisconsin called Simple Studios, and when you heard a CD and it sounded great, you could usually bet that they recorded in Green Bay. So I eventually started working at this studio.
So you were engineering at Simple Studios then?
After I worked in Green Bay, I moved to Madison, Wisconsin, to Smart Studios. And Steve Marker and Butch Vig, the 2 main guys from Madison. And Butch Vig, he's known for producing Nirvana, and he was in a band called Garbage. We're still active.
Yeah.
He worked with Smashing Pumpkins, a lot of 90s bands like that.
So how did you get the gig at Smart Studios?
Well, a friend of mine told me they were looking for an engineer, and it wasn't a thing where they said, here's a full-time job. It was, we see that you're busy, could you do some projects here, and we'll give you some projects as well, sort of a team effort. So that, they were looking for someone that could fill some time in their studio, but someone that they could trust to call their own employee as well. At Smart, I was basically mixing and recording bands, and that process is just, recording all the takes, deciding how the song should sound, making sure you got the best performances. By the time the mixing is done, you should be happy with how it sounds. I mean, you can fix problems, but ideally you love it before it goes to mastering. See, with mixing, you're working with many tracks. The bass drum's on its own track, the bass guitar's on its own track. Everything is very flexible, and you can still do a lot of alterations.
Sure.
In mastering, you're working with a stereo file, so it's 2 tracks, left and right. If you want to make the vocals more bright and present, it could also make the cymbals and guitars brighter, and that could be bad. So it's really not a place to correct one particular thing. It's more of a global approach.
You're not listening at like super loud decibels either. I mean, you're correct. For proper mastering, you want to have a comfortable
Yeah, you
playback.
shouldn't listen too loud. I mean, there's a point at 85 decibels where your ear hears more bass. As you go louder, you hear more bass, and if you listen quieter than 85 decibels, you hear less bass than is really there. So 85 decibels is kind of the sweet spot, and you can endure that for most of the day. I mean, I do take ear breaks, and for some parts of the process, I listen on headphones for more of the quality control. I have a nice set of headphones, so I listen to every piece of audio through the headphones before I send it off for any clicks and pops and glitches, things like that. Stuff that might be missed on in a lesser listening environment.
In the industry, it seems that everybody's trying to make their song louder than the next, and it's created kind of a problem. And you've always been an advocate of keeping dynamics in a master.
For people that are old enough to remember, like when CDs first came out, you didn't realize it at the time, but they weren't all that loud. And then into the 90s, the technology became available to make CDs louder and louder. It's called the limiter. It just basically pushes the level up into a ceiling. The peak level can't get louder, but the average level can keep getting louder. And it does sound good to a certain point, but then you reach a point where it sounds bad. But you want to compete. People kept pushing it further and further every year. And it got to the point where the music is just so distorted now, and people have actually gotten used to it, and especially younger kids, that's all they know. They don't know what music used to sound like. So it got really out of hand, but what's kind of saving it is the streaming services. No matter how loud you make your master, they set the playback level on their end, which means there's no need to make the loudest CD in the world anymore, because if you go past a certain threshold, they just turn it down. So that means you can keep the dynamics in your music again, and you don't have to squish it, and so the waveform looks like a
brick,
unrecognizable. You can actually see the details and the drum hits and the transients. That stuff tends to sound better on the streaming services after they normalize it, because there's actually impact. It has movement.
So let's get back to the transition point
Sure.
from mixing engineer to mastering. So
Right.
how did that evolve?
When I was leaving Smart, I would just freelance at different studios. I would, if someone wanted to do a project, I would pick out the best studio for that project, and we'd rent it out. And then, that's when I started expanding my home setup. You go to the studio and record and do all the big stuff.
Yeah.
Then you can bring it home and do editing, and even some mixing. And as the music industry started tanking, the budgets weren't there for big studios anymore. So that was a common thing at Smart, where bands would come in and do their drums and the big stuff.
Sure.
And then they would take it home. So eventually, people just started asking me more and more about mastering, and I really started to study the process, get real serious about it, so that I knew what I was talking about. But I will say one thing about mastering is that it's not as genre specific as, say, producing or mixing. If I only mastered jazz albums, I probably wouldn't be able to work every day, right? So you have to be diverse, because the other difference from mixing and mastering is, like, you can spend a whole day mixing a song, sometimes more. You can comfortably master an album in a day. Like,
sure,
it's very comfortable pace. It's some guys even do more than that. So in order to stay busy, you have to diversify. You have to be good in just about any genre that gets thrown at you.
You're able to master an album in a day, which
Right.
is great for bands. It's all about quick turnover. They have to send it out to get pressed. They're not waiting for 6 to 8 weeks or to get their masters back.
Yeah, and that's one thing I like about the process, is it's very fast paced. And as I was transitioning out of mastering, I would still try to take on mixing projects, and the two schedules just did not jive. It's too hard to do both, I find, because they're just so different paced. And usually mixing takes longer than expected, right? So bands have this idea, we're going to have a CD release show on this weekend. And they're still mixing and mixing and mixing. But yeah, it needs to be quick turnover. Like I said, they're usually up against the wall with the schedule anyways. And so the faster I can get that through, the better for them.
So you were at Smart Studios, you moved back to Milwaukee, you're freelancing. Now, look at this, we're here, this is a beautiful studio. You put a lot of work and time into the gear you're using, software. Tell us about this and how that next step happened.
Yeah, well, when I was still recording, I got lucky where there was a mastering studio in my neighborhood in Milwaukee, and the owner said, "Hey, I'm going to move out of state. Would you like to rent my studio?" And he took all the equipment, of course, but the room was already built, and all the panels. All I had to do was bring in my own gear. So that was a great stepping stone to start getting serious about mastering. So that's why I invested in some of my own gear for mastering specifically, and made a pretty big turn into that. Started looking for other options, and there's a studio across town that had an open room, and actually, they had asked me would I want to move my studio there and start doing work for them? Because they do music for licensing, like background music for
that
videos.
License Lab?
Yeah, it's called the License Lab, and that's when they just started. So it was sort of an experimental thing. It was like,
Sure.
because they were doing licensing music, but it was a different structure, and this was a new focused company for them, and I was to be their mastering guy. So sort of in exchange for the room, I would do their mastering work. I liked the space and I liked the people, but it was cutting into my productivity a little bit. So, we happened to buy this house. You just need a nice, quiet, and good sounding listening room. So I thought this could work. And that's when I was extremely comfortable that I was not recording anymore. I guess I sort of always felt this attachment, like I need to be close to a studio in case mastering doesn't work out. I can record something.
Yeah.
Well, the 2 studios before that had that option, though I never needed it. Finally, this was like, okay, I'm not recording anymore. This is actually the quietest studio I've ever had, because even the first official mastering room I had, there was another studio that shared the building, and then eventually an apartment upstairs, and there's just a little more noise than I signed up for, even though it was built out very nicely. And then the second place was also in a multi-studio facility, so I was just sort of always battling a little bit of ambient noise coming in. So I mean, this place is just so quiet and peaceful. I can focus more on the music, and it allows me to do better work and just hear the music more accurately. But being here has, it has allowed me to expand the equipment and keep upgrading that and get that to where I want it, because I don't have as much overhead as like a big building. And the other thing too is, with the internet, clients don't really come in anymore. I do just as much stuff from other states and other countries as I do Milwaukee. After I worked in Green Bay, I moved to Madison, Wisconsin, to Smart Studios, and they would require, instead of buying reels of tape, they would require bands to buy their own hard drive. Because back then, hard drive space was not so affordable. I mean, it was kind of a serious cost, so bands were required to buy their own hard drives. And I don't know how they heard of OWC, but when I got there, they were using OWC hard drives. They just said, this is what we use. They ship very quickly. It shows up, you could call at 5 at night, or place an order like in the evening, and it's there the next day, which is great.
And then at that point, everything was like Pro Tools and digital, right? Or were they still doing like analog, reel-to-reel kind of stuff?
Yeah.
And you brought up the point that, clients had to bring in their own hard drives, or I'm sure they could purchase one even through the studio, right?
Yeah, it was part of the cost. I mean, it would just be added onto the bill. But,
Okay.
Like before Pro Tools, you would record, and then on the bill would be, so many reels of tape. And now it's just, one hard drive, maybe a backup hard drive.
Did you have great reliability? Did you have any issues, or was it pretty consistent?
No, it's very consistent, and that's kind of the beauty of it, is it should be transparent. I mean, you want it to work, but you shouldn't have to think about it or fight with it and say, oh, this hard drive's acting up, or did it just crash? It was just the OWC stuff was so robust and reliable, and then I would go on the website and I would see that it's compatible with Pro Tools. Years ago, Pro Tools was very particular about the chipset in the hard drives that you used to store the audio, and OWC was always very progressive about making sure it's compatible with Pro Tools and other professional, whether it be video editing or audio apps. I could tell it was very friendly to the creative art community, and not just for storage, but actual performance and reliability.
So let's talk about Thunderbolt.
With my iMac, I actually needed 2 of these Thunderbolt 2 docks, because it only has 2 ports on the back, just to get all my screens and my audio gear and my drives working. So that became a real nice way to sort of minimize my setup. Because I have a Thunderbolt chassis back there with the cards in it. So, because a lot of audio cards and interfaces are still PCI, the professional ones. At home you might see a USB or a FireWire interface, but for the real, Thunderbolt and PCI is the fastest connection and best performance, and number of ins and outs. You know, if you need a high number of inputs and outputs, you usually need to be on PCI, which can be done over Thunderbolt.
Sure. Yeah, and I think the Thunderbolt dock is really unique because, you know, you could plug in a keyboard to it, you can plug in displays, you can plug in storage drives. It's really versatile.
Yeah, I've had any number of things plugged into these over the years. The other thing that I've accumulated a lot of too is USB dongles for software. You know?
Oh yeah, iLocks and
most of the stuff runs on iLock, but one of my programs has a special one for their company, and then another. So two of them actually. So I basically have three that I need all the time, and then other things come and go. And the thing that's really saved me just now with the Thunderbolt 3 dock is, with the old iMac, it had a digital output on the back.
Yeah.
So I could go digitally just to listen to iTunes and things from the web. I could go digitally from the iMac to my setup, and it was a nice, clean, pure connection. With the iMac Pro, as great as it is, Apple got rid of that. And I didn't really realize this when I was buying it. Until I hooked it up and it didn't work. But luckily the Thunderbolt 3 dock, you've added a digital output. So now I can still go digitally from the iMac to my monitor controller. And this is not for like projects, but when I'm working, I like to A/B what I'm working on to something from iTunes or Spotify.
Exactly.
And if it goes analog, then there's all sorts of conversions and calibrations.
Exactly, yeah.
That you need to. So this gives me a nice, clean.
It's a quick reference.
Apples to apples. Signal, because otherwise I'd be buying another device just for that simple. That simple process.
Let's get into storage a little bit, because you're like meticulous with your storage. I mean, everything's perfectly labeled. You're running backups. Give us a little bit of a description of how you use ODBC Drives.
Yeah, I mean, with the line of work I'm doing, I have to be really organized because people email me or call me looking for old files, and I have to know where it is and how it's labeled, so I know what it is. And so when I'm working, I have solid-state drives hooked up because they're very fast over Thunderbolt. When I'm done with projects, I put it on. I have a collection of these now. The Thunderbay 4 Mini.
Yep.
So when I'm done with projects, I put them on, there's 4 drives in here. You can run these in a RAID, but I use this more for quantity, so I don't have it in a RAID. But 4 of these, so 16 drives total. And I'm just about done with that, so I need to order more. But, when I'm done with the project, it goes on there, and I have an app that lets me catalog all my archives, so I can search it. So if a certain artist or band emails me, I can search their name, I can find any files related to them in a matter of seconds. And I keep the data cable hooked up, and I just have to plug in the power, and within seconds I have all my archives in front of me, and I can find whatever I need in seconds. Some people might have to search for hours or dig through closets, and I don't have time for that.
It's really cool. Let's talk about the Mercury Elite Pro.
Yeah, that's just I use that still for backups. I have many. I have more than one backup just because you can never have too many. So, this I just plug. Once or twice a day I plug that in, and again it's bus powered, so there's no messing with power cables. It's so fast, and I have an app that just scans for new and changed files. So it doesn't take long to back up. I don't even have to think about it. You set it up once, you plug it in. You wait for it to do its thing, and then you're backed up. You can, and the app will even unmount the drive for you. So you really just plug it into the data cable. So I use that, once or twice a day, and then I keep those in a fireproof case in case of any natural disasters. But
the Envoy Pro. So how many of these do you have? You have 2 of these.
Yeah,
right?
this one stays in my studio. By the computer, every 15 minutes a backup will run. So that if there ever was a drive failure, or if I made a mistake and corrupted a file or something, I would only lose 15 minutes of work. And what I like about it again is it's bus powered. It's very discreet and it's quiet. I mean, it makes no noise. I forget that it's there because and it's so stable. And then I have another one for traveling, because if I do some work with my laptop on the road, it's not always feasible to upload the files to a cloud or something if you're at a hotel with poor internet, And a lot of times in the audio and video, you're working with such big files that it could take a while. And if you're on the go, you don't have time to sit there and upload it. So at least you have a safety copy. You can put it in a different bag. If your laptop is stolen or lost, you still have your work. So these are great for traveling. You know, they feel very durable. And I've had zero issues with them.
Well, you know, we really appreciate you taking the time to talk with us today, and it's people like you who, you know, really make me proud of working for ODBC, and we love being part of the music industry and the video industry and just in the artistic industry, and we really appreciate you, you know, buying our gear and working with us over the years.
All right, well, I mean, I appreciate you guys making it, 'cause I can't imagine working all these years without it. I mean, whenever I need a product, whether it's a hard drive or some other device, if there's an OWC version, I pretty much always prefer the OWC version because it's just going to be reliable, dependable, and, you know, well thought out, and I know it's gonna work. I can plug it in and get to work and not think about it again.
Thank you so much, Justin.
Thanks for having me.
Appreciate your time.